There is a major misunderstanding that most people fall into when they disappear from a narcissist's life. They assume, once I'm gone, they'll be sad, or angry, or empty. But the truth is different, very different. The first thing that happens is not an emotion, it is disorientation. When you disappear properly, without arguing, without explaining, without clinging, without leaving emotional traces, the narcissist does not know what to feel first. Because you did not simply leave their life, you left the internal map they use to determine where they are, who they are, and what power they hold. A narcissist does not live in the emotional world the way most people do. They live inside a coordinate system. In that system, the people around them are not independent individuals, but anchor points, reflective points, regulatory points. And within that coordinate system, you once occupied a very specific position, not because they loved you deeply, but because you helped them orient themselves. So when you disappear, what collapses is not the relationship. What collapses is the ability to locate the self. This is not a story about them missing you. It is not a story about regret or heartbreak. This is the story of the moment when an entire psychological structure built on control, reflection, and prediction begins to fall out of sync with reality. From Carl Jung's perspective, when a persona has existed for too long through external reflection without a genuine inner axis, the disappearance of a single reflective point is enough to throw the entire system into what Jung called an orientation crisis. Not loud, not dramatic, but extremely dangerous. And what makes this process especially profound is this. The narcissist does not immediately realize that you are what has disappeared. They only feel that the world suddenly no longer fits together. The old buttons no longer work. The familiar reflexes no longer trigger responses. The strategies that once always succeeded now fall into empty space. From that moment on, a completely new psychological process begins, not a process of grief, but a process in which the capacity to control inner reality begins to disintegrate. Stage 1. Disorientation. When you disappear completely from a narcissist's life, the first thing that occurs is not emotion in the ordinary human sense, but a profound and difficult to name existential misalignment, a form of ego orientation crisis that, through the lens of Carl Jung, can be understood as the moment the persona loses its reflective point and can no longer recognize itself. At this stage, the narcissist is not yet grieving, not yet angry, and may not even be sure what they have just lost. But they begin to experience a prolonged abnormal state. The world no longer responds to them in familiar ways. Interactions no longer generate internal validation, and reality seems to stop providing a stable sense of where they exist. Before you left, your presence functioned as a psychological anchor, a form of external ego regulation through which they unconsciously measured their own value, whether they were still being noticed, still having an impact, still able to control the emotional rhythm of another person. When you withdraw in silence, without argument, without justification, without leaving any emotional residue for them to decode, what is taken away is not love, but feedback data, the very material the narcissistic personality structure depends on to maintain a sense of stability. Because this personality is built on an externally oriented self rather than a solid inner ego, your absence does not produce clear pain, but a state of cognitive disorientation in which familiar psychological reflexes can no longer find an object to activate. The narcissist continues daily life as usual, still socializing, still laughing, still operating the social persona smoothly, yet internally they begin to sense that behaviors which once generated power now feel hollow, words that once carried impact no longer resonate, and strategies that once made them feel in control now fall into empty space. This is a particularly dangerous state, not because it causes acute suffering, but because it introduces a baseline disturbance into the system of self-perception. It is like a navigation system that is still running but has lost satellite signal, making every movement uncertain even though nothing has visibly collapsed. At a deeper level, what is weakening is the self-referential loop, the cycle through which the narcissist continuously confirms who I am by influencing others. When this loop is disrupted without an immediate replacement, the mind enters a suspended condition, a liminal state between control and loss of control. Notably, at this stage, they do not yet try to pull you back, do not hoover, do not manipulate, because their psychological system is still attempting to self-correct, to scan for errors, to locate the source of the misalignment, like a machine running diagnostics but finding no clear error code. This very ambiguity becomes the foundation for everything that follows, because it places the narcissist in an experience entirely opposite to their familiar psychological structure. No object to control, no reaction to read, no signal to orient by, and therefore no quick way to restore a sense of certainty about the self. This is not suffering in an emotional sense, but a form of ontological insecurity, where the question, where do I stand in other people's world, no longer has an answer. When that question hangs unanswered long enough, it begins to erode the foundation upon which the entire narcissistic personality is built. For this reason, the stage of disorientation is quiet, not dramatic. Yet, it is the true beginning of disintegration, because from this moment onward, the narcissist is no longer operating within a predictable reality, and once predictability is broken, every defensive mechanism that follows manipulation, rage, obsession, panic, becomes nothing more than a desperate attempt to reconstruct a coordinate system that has already been lost. Stage 2. System self-check. After the state of disorientation quietly stabilizes into a lingering background discomfort, the narcissistic psyche enters a highly characteristic phase that is rarely visible from the outside. A system self-check. This is not moral reflection, nor emotional contemplation. It is closer to a technical process than a human one, a silent attempt to restore inner order by scanning what has just stopped working. At this stage, the narcissist no longer focuses on external reality, but turns inward to replay past interactions. Yet they do not remember you in a nostalgic sense. They remember in the way a machine tries to determine the exact point at which a familiar reaction chain began to malfunction. Moments that were previously overlooked suddenly come under scrutiny, a time you stayed silent longer than usual, a reply that no longer carried the familiar tone, a small boundary they had not noticed before. These details do not evoke emotion, they provoke suspicion. What is crucial to understand is this: the narcissist does not ask, "What did I do wrong?" They ask, "Why did this strategy stop working?" Within their psychological structure, a relationship is not stored as an interpersonal experience, but as a sequence of behavioral patterns. When that sequence is disrupted without a clear explanation, the mind enters diagnostic mode, searching for a fault in the input-output chain. Here, you are not reconstructed as an independent person, but as a variable whose behavior changed. They revisit memory not to understand you, but to identify what caused the old reflexes to stop producing the expected results. This is why they may recall seemingly minor details with striking precision while completely overlooking your emotional depth, because what they are searching for is not truth, but a point at which control can be restored. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment the persona attempts to reconfigure reality in order to avoid confronting the shadow that is beginning to surface. The narcissist cannot accept the possibility that you saw through their structure and chose to withdraw, because that would pose a direct threat to the self-image they depend on to exist. Instead, the mind gravitates toward less dangerous interpretations. You changed because you were weak, because you were influenced by others, because of a misunderstanding, because you could not handle the pressure. These interpretations are not deliberate lies. They are ego preservation mechanisms. As long as the cause is located outside the self, the structure of self-esteem remains untouched. The problem, however, is that these explanations do not generate a sense of stability. They may sound reasonable in thought, but they do not produce the feeling that the issue has been resolved. Because no matter how the theory is constructed, reality continues to hold one undeniable fact. You are not coming back, and there is no signal that the old system will be restored. This mismatch between internal explanation and external data is what causes this stage to persist in a state of mild but enduring tension. The narcissist may appear calm, even confident to others, but internally they are constantly comparing, testing, simulating. They imagine different scenarios if they had phrased that sentence differently, reacted sooner, kept you at a closer distance, not out of regret, but to test whether there existed a branching point at which control should not have been lost. Notably, at this stage they still do not take direct action. Action carries risk. If they intervene and fail, the final hypothesis of control collapses. So they delay, observe, and keep everything within internal review. This is the phase of silent thinking, of closed cognitive loops, where the narcissist still believes that if they can understand the problem correctly, everything can return to its old trajectory. Yet this very process exposes an uncomfortable truth. Their system only functions with your participation. Without response from you, every simulation lacks live data. Every analysis turns in on itself within a closed space. And when a system can only talk to itself, it begins to lose the ability to distinguish between real control and imagined control. This is where the groundwork for the next stage is laid, when system checking no longer produces a sense of safety, and cognitive suspension gradually transforms into inner discomfort, then into egoic agitation. But at this stage, everything still unfolds in silence, in thought, in invisible analytical loops that no one on the outside can see. Stage 3. Influence recovery impulse. When egoic agitation can no longer be contained internally, the narcissistic psyche begins to move outward. Not in the form of direct attack, and not yet as overt manipulation, but as very small, very discrete probes of power impulses with a highly specific aim to test whether their influence still exists. At this stage, the narcissist does not act out of emotion. They act out of a need to confirm access. Within their psychological structure, influence is not something to be requested. It is something that was once assumed to be permanently available. When your silence persists long enough to destabilize their internal system, the ego is forced to test reality. Is that door truly closed, or merely temporarily unresponsive? What matters is this: they are not targeting you as a person. They are targeting reaction. Any reaction, curiosity, discomfort, defensiveness, even anger has value, because it confirms one thing only: I still exist within your field of awareness. For this reason, the impulses at this stage are typically indirect, ambiguous, and easily misread if observed only on the surface. The narcissist may reappear in seemingly accidental ways: a social signal, a minor action just noticeable enough to register, but not explicit enough to be named. They may reference you through others, creating presence without dialogue. They may display a version of themselves that appears more successful, happier, or more virtuous than before, not because they are well, but because they need to measure whether that image still has impact. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment the persona attempts to reclaim symbolic space after losing direct reflection. The narcissist cannot tolerate being written out of the narrative without a final confirmation. So they seek to re-enter at the margins of the story, not to reconnect, but to ensure that the story still revolves around them to some degree. At this stage, you may notice very concrete manifestations, staged appearances, half messages, behaviors that are disruptive enough to register but not explicit enough to confront. This is not random. It is a low-cost strategy. If you react, they obtain data. If you do not, they lose nothing except the need to try again with a different variation. What makes this stage dangerous is not its intensity, but its repetitiveness. Each signal that goes unanswered does not immediately stop the behavior, it sharpens the impulse. Because at this point, the narcissist has shifted from internal regulation to external verification. They need reality to confirm what the inner system can no longer generate on its own. However, if your silence remains intact, something critical occurs. These impulses begin to fail functionally, not because they are not sent, but because they do not produce enough response to soothe the ego. And when a behavior is repeated without yielding the expected outcome, it ceases to function as a strategy. It becomes a source of irritation. This is the threshold between probing and escalation. When access is not restored, the narcissist is forced to confront a possibility they have long avoided. Their influence has limits, and those limits are not within their control. From this moment onward, the process enters a new phase one, in which surface composure is no longer sufficient to conceal internal failure, and impulses to recover influence begin to transform into clearer emotional reactions, often colored by anger, contempt, or devaluation. Stage 4. Cold rage and devaluation. When impulses to recover influence fail to produce response, the narcissistic psyche shifts into a distinctly different state. Cold rage. This is not explosive anger, no shouting, no overt confrontation. It is quiet, surface controlled, and often disguised as indifference or contempt. At its core, however, it is a very concrete reaction to a difficult reality. Access has not been restored. At this stage, the narcissist no longer asks, "Do I still have influence?" They begin to assert that such influence is no longer necessary. And the way they do this is through devaluation. You are no longer referenced as a person with significance, but as something outdated, a poor choice, an insignificant phase. This is not an objective reassessment. It is a psychological strategy designed to minimize ego injury. Cold rage emerges when the ego cannot reclaim power, but also cannot accept defeat. So it chooses the lower risk path, denying the value of what it cannot control. Instead of saying, "I can no longer reach you," they say, "You were never important." The narrative is rewritten not to convince you are no longer there, but to reassure themselves. In practice, this stage is often accompanied by very ordinary behaviors. Sarcastic remarks when you are mentioned, comments that appear neutral but carry a diminishing tone, retelling the relationship as though you were the problematic one, difficult, weak, or inadequate. This is not emotional expression. It is self-image management under conditions of lost control. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment the persona tightens to prevent the shadow from surfacing. The shadow here is not guilt, but the awareness of limitation, the recognition that someone has left and cannot be pulled back. To avoid facing this, the ego devalues the departed object in order to preserve the image of "I am still above" from fully collapsing. It is important to note that cold rage does not bring relief. It merely creates a temporary shell. Because devaluation generates no feedback and produces no real sense of control, it only reduces pressure in the short term. Inside, the discomfort remains, now covered by deliberate contempt. At this stage, the narcissist often presents themselves as done, unbothered, no longer concerned. But if you look closely, a paradox appears. They mention you more than necessary, not because they miss you, but because the ego is still processing data it has not fully integrated. Your continued presence in their speech is evidence that the process is not yet complete. Cold rage also marks an important shift. From this point on, behaviors related to you are no longer light probes, but begin to take on a defensive intent. They are no longer seeking reaction in order to reconnect, but attempting to redefine your position at a lower level so that the loss of control becomes psychologically tolerable. However, it is precisely here that a contradiction begins to form. Devaluation only works when the object is still present to be devalued. When you remain silent, not responding, not engaging, not participating in the rewritten narrative, the entire effort goes unconfirmed. And a psychological system that depends on reflection cannot complete this process in isolation. From here, the process is forced to continue. When contempt is no longer sufficient to conceal the loss of power, and when your silence remains intact, cold rage begins to transform into a deeper state of disturbance, one in which the ego is not only challenged, but starts to register a form of injury that is difficult to reverse. Stage 5. Ego, injury, and fear of replacement. When devaluation no longer produces a sense of control and your silence remains unchanged, the narcissistic psyche reaches a very real point. Ego injury. This is not sadness in the ordinary sense, nor is it remorse. It is a cold, deep fracture that is difficult to process, because it does not come from direct words or actions, but from a sustained and undeniable reality. You have left, and you do not need them in order to continue living in a stable way. At this stage, the narcissist begins to clearly feel a threat that previously existed only in vague form, the fear of being replaced. Not merely replaced by another person, but displaced from the central position in your inner world. What unsettles them is not the loss of you, but the loss of the irreplaceable role they once believed they held. In practice, narcissistic structures do not measure value through attachment, but through exclusivity. They need to believe they are the primary reference point, the non-substitutable source of influence. When you remain silent, do not react, do not collapse, and do not return seeking validation. The ego is forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable possibility. Their influence is no longer a necessary condition for your stability. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment the shadow makes deep contact with the persona, not the shadow of morality, but the shadow of replaceability. The narcissist begins to sense a void where the image of "I am indispensable" once existed. And because their ego is not built to tolerate this experience, the response is not acceptance, but control-based anxiety. At the behavioral level, this fear often manifests in very concrete ways. They begin monitoring you from a distance, gathering information indirectly, reacting strongly to any sign that you are doing well or moving forward. Not because they care about your well-being, but because your stability contradicts the internal narrative they require in order to function. Every sign that you do not need them becomes data that threatens the ego. What is important to note is that the fear of replacement does not necessarily involve a new person. In many cases, what unsettles the narcissist most is the possibility that you have replaced them with yourself, with boundaries, with clarity, with an inner life no longer dependent on external reaction. This is a form of replacement they cannot compete with, cannot effectively smear, and cannot manipulate. At this stage, the narcissistic psyche enters a paradox. They want to deny your importance, yet they cannot stop tracking signals related to you. This contradiction is not accidental. It reflects an ego that has been injured but has not found a way to heal. And because there is no response from you to close the loop, the process cannot resolve quickly. Ego injury at this stage does not express itself as overt suffering. It exists as background pressure, discomfort, anxiety, heightened comparison, exaggerated reactions to perceived disregard. The narcissist may attempt to compensate through attention from elsewhere, but such compensation is only temporary, because it does not address the core issue. You have withdrawn from their validation system. From here, the process is forced to continue in one of two directions. Either they intensify efforts to restore influence through more forceful strategies, or they enter a deeper defensive phase one in which the narrative freezes, emotion is suppressed, and your silence becomes a fact they cannot erase, only live alongside. Stage 6. Final defense. Freezing, narrative rewriting, or delayed hoovering. When ego injury reaches its threshold and the fear of replacement can no longer be denied, the narcissistic psyche is forced to activate its final defensive layer. This is no longer a phase of testing or impulsive reaction. It is a phase of restructuring for survival. The goal is not to get you back, but to keep the ego from collapsing completely. At this stage, the narcissist understands, even if never articulated, that direct access has ended. This creates a very specific pressure. If influence cannot be restored, the system must be frozen to prevent the sense of failure from spreading. As a result, one of three defensive strategies will emerge, depending on the degree of injury, current sources of supply, and the individual's personality structure. The first strategy is emotional freezing. The narcissist no longer attempts to provoke reaction or gather information. They become cold, dry, and psychologically cut off. But this is not peace. It is controlled numbness. Emotions are not processed. They are compressed to avoid facing the most painful question: why am I no longer important? This state allows them to maintain social functioning, but the cost is an increasingly fixed inner void. The second strategy is rewriting the story and freezing that version in place. This is when the final narrative is set. You were the problem, you did not understand them, you were unworthy, or the relationship never had real value. What matters is this: the story is no longer revised. It is not meant to convince you you are no longer there, but to create a version of reality stable enough for them to live with without constant self-doubt. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment the persona becomes fixed in order to prevent the shadow from breaking the ego structure from within. The third strategy, and the one most likely to cause confusion, is delayed hoovering. It is not loud, not passionate, not desperate. Delayed hoovering often takes the form of maturity, closure, checking in, or a vague apology. But its essence is not a desire to reconnect. It is a final attempt to re-establish a symbolic point of contact. Even a single response, even a cold one, is enough for the ego to register that it has not been completely erased from your system. What all three strategies share is this: they are designed to avoid the truth, not resolve it. And the truth is simple but unbearable. You left without needing them, and reality continued to function. This stage is therefore not transformative for the narcissist. It is stabilizing. They do not grow from this point. They learn how to live with a limit they cannot overcome. What is notable is that from this moment on, your influence over the narcissist no longer lies in action, but in sustained silence. Each day you do not respond, do not appear, do not participate in their narrative is another day this defensive structure must maintain itself without new data to adjust it. And a structure that must sustain itself in isolation eventually becomes rigid, dry, and prone to fracture. This is also why, even when the narcissist appears to have moved on externally, the truth of you never fully disappears from their psychological system. Not as a memory, but as a boundary point, living proof that there are people who leave and cannot be pulled back, forms of power that cannot be restored, and silences that cannot be manipulated. This stage has no climax. There is no clear ending. Only a quiet truth is established. The game ended because one person stopped playing, and that is the one reality the entire narcissistic system cannot rewrite, only avoid and live alongside. When looking back at all 6 stages, the most important thing to understand is this. You did not cause the narcissist's internal collapse, and you are not the one who defeated them in any dramatic sense. What unfolded inside them was not the result of a specific action, but the inevitable outcome when a psychological structure that lives on the reactions of others is cut off from its source of nourishment. You did nothing. You simply were no longer there, and that is precisely what the narcissistic psyche cannot process. Throughout this entire process, the narcissist never truly confronted you as an independent human being. They confronted a limit they had never been forced to accept before. That there are people who leave and cannot be pulled back, silences that are not tactics, and losses that cannot be repaired through manipulation, reinterpretation, or time. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is not awakening, but a point of contact with a shadow that the ego lacks the capacity to integrate and therefore must defend against, freeze, or rewrite in order to continue existing. This also explains why you never receive a beautiful ending. There is no complete apology, no genuine accountability, no moment in which they admit that you were right, not because you were undeserving, but because a clear ending would force them to face the truth, and that truth threatens the entire structure they rely on to survive. But you also need to understand something equally important. Your silence is not a punishment imposed on them. It is not revenge. It is not a strategy. It is simply the natural consequence of no longer participating in a system that harms you. And in the psychological world, no message is clearer than consistent withdrawal. From the moment you step out, the story no longer continues in their direction. It ends not because it has been resolved, but because you are no longer the fuel that allows it to keep burning. The narcissist may continue living, adapting, finding replacement sources, constructing new narratives, but within their inner structure, the truth remains as an unerasable boundary. There was once someone who left whom they could not control, could not redefine through reaction, and could not pull back through familiar power. And for you, what matters most is not how they feel afterward. What matters is this: you no longer need to know. When you stop tracking their process, stop measuring your worth through their reactions, and stop waiting for delayed recognition, that is when the story truly ends. Not an ending for them, an ending for you. You did not defeat them. You exited the game. And in any power system built on manipulation, there is no greater failure than losing the one who was willing to play.